So I'm going to just kind of give you a brief introduction here to our theme tonight, and then read to you from Shantideva's great text, the Bodhicharyavatara, or the Bodhisattva Way of Life. And just to kind of give you an orientation of this practice that we're going to be focusing on, this practice that is called Tonglen. Tonglen is a Tibetan compound word. The Tong means sending out, sending forth, and Len means receiving or coming in, basically. And so we can translate this term as Tonglen as sending and receiving, and it really is fundamentally a compassion meditation that we find in a set of teachings called Lojong in Tibetan Buddhism. And we've done, actually, there are 59 slogans divided into 7 parts, these Lojong slogans. This is also called 7-point mind training in the Tibetan Buddhism tradition. And so we're not going to cover all 59 slogans. We're only going to go over the ones relative here to this practice that we're looking at. Now, on YouTube, there was a whole series. We actually spent many weeks, I believe it was in 2020, in the middle of the pandemic. Every week we took a slogan and we unpacked it and went through. And I don't know any of you recall that who were here during that period, but it took us a while to get through all 59 slogans. I don't know that we actually got through all 59, but we covered sort of the greatest hits of Lojong. But we did most of them. So those are on YouTube. If you're interested in kind of exploring more of that, there also are some really excellent books. And one of the ones that I like the most is by Norman Fisher. And oh my gosh, what is it called? Norman Fisher, Compassion. It's on compassion in the Lojong teachings. Even though he is a Zen teacher, he dives deeply into these mind training, these slogans, and really does a beautiful job of making them accessible to all of us, so that it's not quite so complex and rooted in abstract thoughts, but very sort of ground level. So it's a really good overview of them. And there are other books on this too. So I'm going to read you something here, and this sort of will lay the foundation for our conversation. Thank you, Sagan. Hello, Sagan. Nice seeing you. Training in compassion. Yes, that is it. And considering that I've used that every year in one of my classes, you would think I'd remember it, but yeah. Actually, Sagan, I think we read that together, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. So this is by Shantideva, the 8th century Indian Buddhist, who writes about this quality we call bodhicitta, or mind of awakening. And we'll unpack that in a moment. All sufferings are without an owner because they are not different. They should be warded off simply because they are suffering. Why is any restriction made in this case? Why should suffering be prevented? Because everyone agrees, if it must be warded off, then all of it must be warded off. And if not, then this goes for oneself as it does for everyone else. So there's a qualm that he poses. Much suffering comes from compassion. So why should one force suffering to arise? The response: after seeing the suffering of the world, how can this suffering from compassion be considered great? If the suffering of many disappears because of the suffering of one, then a compassionate person should induce that suffering for their own sake, and as well as for the sake of others. Therefore, Supushpanchandra, although knowing the king's animosity, did not avoid his own suffering as a sacrifice for many people in misery. Those whose mind streams are cultivated in meditation and who equally accept the suffering of others dive into hell realms like swans into a pool of lotuses. And they become oceans of joy when sentient beings are liberated from that suffering. Have they not found fulfillment? After all, what is the use of artificial liberation, if there is such a thing? Thus, although working for the benefit of others, there is neither conceit nor dismay, and on account of the thirst for the single goal of benefiting others, there is no desire for the result of the maturation of one's karma. Therefore, to the extent that I protect myself from disparagement, so shall I generate a spirit of protection and a spirit of compassion towards all others. So this passage, this text, in fact, is one of the very first places where we actually find some of these teachings of bodhicitta. There is a nod to sending and receiving here. So Shantideva existed in the 7th, 8th century. He was a master who was actually not terribly well liked by his community because he didn't do the practices. He didn't show up for the Dharma talks. And yet he was seen to also have great ability, a great capacity for insight. And so one day they invited him into the hall, the meditation hall, and they thought they were going to teach him a lesson. So the first part of the story is they were going to have him go and deliver a Dharma talk on the reading for that day. And the second challenge was they put his chair so high that he wouldn't be able to climb up and sit in it. And so, well, he showed up. Of course, he showed up late and somehow ended up ascending into this chair and gave this amazing Dharma talk that became this text, focusing on what we call the mind of awakening, or bodhicitta. So bodhi, B-O-D-H-I, bodhi meaning awakening. Chitta means mind, and yet this is not the same as intellect, brain, all of that. But really we're talking about heart. We're talking about mind here originating from the heart itself. This is the meaning of mind. It's not just thoughts, but it's every part of us, sentience and sapience, both unified in this. And here in this passage, by the way, after he gave this talk, apparently he left. I guess his work there was done. I find it an amusing story, so I like telling it. Interestingly, this first part, so there are a couple of things just to unpack in this. First, he says sufferings are without an owner because they are not different. Well, I don't know about you, but man, does it feel personal when we're suffering, especially if we are being singled out, if we are being somehow wronged or violated in some way. But really the spirit of what he's saying here is that the suffering of one person, regardless of what kind of suffering it is, because of interdependence, is also my suffering. Your suffering is in some way my suffering. It doesn't mean it's exactly the same suffering, right? The same experience. But this general category of whether we call it sorrow, grief, loss, whatever it may be, sadness, anger, we all sort of know what that feels like. So he really makes a point here, an intention here, of closing the gap between ourselves and others. And this is one of the things that characterizes the bodhisattva, or the being of enlightenment, the being of awakening, through compassionate response to suffering in a spontaneous, natural, and skillful way. That is the being of a bodhisattva. And the Bodhisattva here knows that fundamental unity between you and me, even though we may be different, we may have different backgrounds and experiences and histories, there is this essence of unity that is also fully present. And this is seen to be something that alleviates suffering. Knowing this alleviates suffering, and we bring this spirit, this presence of unity when we interact with someone when they're suffering. This is really kind of the wave showing up as a bodhisattva. We know this. We know the truth of interdependence and unity. This is why, whatever is good for myself or bad for myself is also good or bad for other people, because of that interdependence. And suffering arises when we don't recognize that truth. So this is between the lines of what Shantideva is telling us. And why it's hard, and why real, true bodhicitta, true compassion can sometimes be a challenge. So this is the dialogue he is bringing us here in this passage. So protection, as he says in this last line, protection of oneself becomes also protection of others. Protection of others becomes oneself. So it's really seeing that interbeing, as Thich Nhat Hanh often used to talk about it. And then around the 10th century, a Bengali monk named Atisha began to take a lot of these teachings of mind training, these 59 slogans that I mentioned earlier, although they weren't when he was doing this, as compassion training, as bodhicitta, teaching bodhicitta and the method to attain, to realize ultimate bodhicitta. He decided that he was to go to the Tibetan plateau and carry this body of teachings with him. And yet, he had heard that the Tibetan people were actually quite loving already, quite serene, quite sort of abiding already in well-being, in natural and lasting happiness. So in order to teach them, he brought along this very irascible and ill-tempered attendant, a young man who just gave him constant grief, criticized Atisha constantly. Now, if you can imagine at that period, traveling all that way from Bengal all the way up into the Tibetan plateau with somebody like this, who is just giving you nonstop grief. This was his practice to work with it, and then also to use these as examples, apparently. Well, when he got to Tibet, apparently he realized that there actually was no need for that. I don't know how long this journey took, but apparently he got there and realized, they really also can use these teachings of compassion and taking difficulties onto the path. Literally, that is one of the 7 points. And then following Atisha's teaching, these teachings of what we call Lojong got systematized even more by the 12th century master Geshe Chekawa Yeshe Dorje. So any of you that were around a couple of years ago when we were doing the slogans, the Lojong slogans, you might remember I read incessantly from his commentary, his teaching, which is really like where we find the form of the 7-point mind training and the 59 slogans really systematized and laid out. So that happened in and around the 12th century. And right at the very beginning, so he begins with preliminaries, the Lojong teachings, and then moves into very quickly into the stages. And here in this huge book I have of the mind training, this is from the great collection, Library of Tibetan Classics. It's a large volume, but it goes in great depth with many different commentators, Tibetan monks and masters who comment on these teachings. And here in the very first, this is the very first. So training in the ultimate awakening mind. Cheko Ayeshi Dorji writes about the meditation session. He systematizes this one. This is where Tonglen arises from. And it systematized sort of what Shantideva talked about in the Bodhicharyavatara. Actually, he quotes Shantideva here in this text. One who wishes to quickly rescue both themselves and others should practice the secret instruction, the exchanging of self and others. If you do not thoroughly exchange your own happiness with others' suffering, you will not become a Buddha. Even in samsara, there will be no happiness. Hence, to assuage your own injuries and to pacify other sufferings, you should give your own self to others and protect others as you would yourself. So this is hearkening back to some of what Shantideva said. Now here's the point, and I think that this is a fair point to make. It sounds awfully sacrificial, doesn't it? I'm going to suffer so others don't have to. And in the courses at HDS that I teach on chaplaincy, we often will talk about this is not a sacrifice of your well-being to do this work. But that's not what's being conveyed here. And the subtext of these teachings is that by training and building capacity to be present to suffering with equanimity, we are not basically causing ourselves harm as much as it may feel to take on the sufferings of others. Yeah. Now, when I first practiced Tonglen, it was with a great teacher. I'm not going to say who he was because he's somebody that I very much respect. But he used to teach us when I lived in Santa Barbara. He used to teach us Dzogchen practices, and one of the practices he would do regularly was Tonglen, and he would teach it and begin by having us breathe in, receive the Len of Tonglen. Receive the suffering out in the world, the sticky, smoky, smelly, sweaty suffering, the dark clouds of suffering, breathing that right into my body. And then breathing out, we send forth just the clear beauty, the pristine, spacious, bright quality of compassion. So we're exchanging the suffering in the world with the love that we're sending out. Well, when I started doing that, I would constantly get nauseous. I would get really sick to my stomach every time. And finally I went to him and I said, person, I said, why does this keep happening? Like it's so bad that I almost feel like I have to run out and go to the bathroom. And I have a very strong stomach. It takes a lot to make me nauseous. And he looked at me and he smiled and he said, that just means you're doing it right. That was it. So I didn't practice it again for about 15 years. I never went back to it. It wasn't something that I felt called to do until I was a chaplain at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute in Boston. And people would ask me about this practice. And I wasn't going to say, oh, this practice has no merit because, if you have cancer in your body, well, you've got enough suffering in there. And this is what I would say. I would say practice with the second half of just radiating, or practice metta, practice loving kindness, practice extending loving kindness, and first offering it to yourself and then to others. And that was it. That was my only advice. Until I went through a very difficult, very painful separation with my ex-wife. This was back in around 2013, 2014, almost 10 years ago. And I needed rescuing from the grief. I needed something to help me work my way through the grief. This isn't something I wanted. I didn't want to separate. It was extremely painful. It wasn't just the loss of a spouse, but it was a loss of a best friend. It was the loss of what we said were soulmates, right? All of these things that it was very, very hard time for me. And it drove me back to exploring Tonglen after all those years. And a dear friend of mine, Lama Willa, who kind of coached me through this during that period, she said, and I told her my experience with Tonglen, she said, go back to the teachings and reread them. She said, it's one thing, if your aspiration is to take in the suffering of others, of, the universal clouds of suffering. But she said, you have to know how to hold your own suffering first. That made sense. Yeah. If I can't bear my own grief, how on earth am I going to take on this abstract form of universal suffering? And so I went back to the Lojong teachings and found these points among the 59 slogans, and it made all the difference. And so slogan, training in conventional mind of awakening, begins by saying, train in the two, giving and taking alternately. Okay, use your breath, breathe in the suffering, breathe out compassion. Okay, this is what I had done years before. Place the two astride your breath. That is the next slogan. And then the text goes on to talk about the three poisons, the three virtues, and so on. Greed, hatred, delusion. So basically see them as being located in some way within those categories. And in all actions, train by means of the words, okay? May the sufferings of beings ripen upon me, although my virtues, may they all achieve happiness. And then the third category here is taking adverse conditions onto the path of enlightenment. And what this means is, in addition to other things, begin with yourself first. This is how we train. We train first, not just beginning, and many books. You might go out and purchase a book on Tonglen or on compassion within which Tonglen is being practiced. That's fine. A lot of popular authors, a lot of teachers will actually begin with the advanced practice. This is what was happening to me. I hadn't trained, after all, to unearth all of my own woundedness, my own pain that had been there since childhood, much less training to hold what is present, and much even less to train to hold what is out in the universe, in the world. So ever since that period, I began practicing with my own grief, to the point where it was so profound that in the midst of the grief, I actually found an incredible wellspring of love, and revisited the practice, began to own the practice and apply it to this kind of really hard, challenging stuff that I knew needed to be taken onto the path. Yeah, everything was integrated. And after all, I'd been meditating by then for over 2 decades. So that helped. I felt nothing but love in the midst of that grief. And it became one of the best experiences for my practice, was practicing with pain. That's when I started to think about even bringing this to classes and talking about it publicly, and then began teaching it. So I have several benefactors to thank for this. That original teacher, my meditation teachers, my ex, gratitude for that. And by the way, we're still very good friends. So, yeah. And then, of course, to Willa, who helped pointed me in the right direction, and then to all the great masters who basically supported this notion of training to get to training authentically, to holding my own suffering, much less the suffering of others. This is what is meant by artificial, when Shantideva talks about artificial aspiration or artificial awakening, that it can't just be a nice idea that we sit with when we're comfortable, but that it's something that we are fundamentally building a capacity to hold with equanimity, and yet also highly engaged with what we're feeling. And so here, what we're talking about are three categories. And so this is how I have been teaching Tonglen for almost 10 years now. First, and this is what we'll do this evening, is practicing with a state, a feeling, an emotion that is very much alive for us. And if it's not alive, perhaps we choose, and this is also the choice that we have, the quote unquote free will, in choosing to respond to suffering, including our own, by making space for it, allowing that feeling, thought, experience, whatever it might be, some space to simply abide, and without shutting it down. Now, this can be challenging. As we talked about in this morning's session with Tajay, we talked a bit about emotions and feeling states. We spend a lot of time in this life trying to be okay with whatever has happened to us, whatever we're carrying, to the point where we function as best we can. So part of the question in Shantideva's passage is, why would anybody want to do this? Why on earth would I want to do this? Well, and part of it, I think, in modern language, has to do with avoiding what we can call spiritual bypass. Yeah. So if you haven't heard of this term, basically it is ignoring all the bad stuff so that we can just quickly get to the good stuff. And yet that has a fallout. We don't really metabolize deeply those imprints, those patterns, the pain, the anxiety, the sorrow, whatever it might be, by ignoring them. Out of sight is not out of mind. So we work our way through it. We allow the suffering to exist. We give it a welcoming, almost a guest house or like a mansion, to roam freely. And yet, in the midst of that, we're also bringing a sense of spaciousness, of heart, of love, of concern, of self-care in the midst of it. This is what I mean by building capacity with our own suffering, or taking difficulties onto the path, so that we're building a capacity that allows for more curiosity. And within that capacity and curiosity arises an even deeper sense of caring. So capacity building, curiosity or interest, caring. Yeah. So that's the first way, is working with something that I have, that I'm carrying, something manageable if we're practicing. And part of that process is to also remind yourself that others too feel this very feeling. Again, Shantideva, right there in Bodhicharyavatara, that this suffering that I am feeling, it belongs to so many others too, throughout history, throughout the present, throughout the future. So I'm not alone in this. Right there, that this recognition that this feeling that I have is common to so many begins to turn the heart outward a little bit more. Suddenly we're not immersed in this solitude of our own pain, but we're able to sort of open and say, yes, this too is universal, this very feeling. This is classic Shantideva, although it took 600 years for Geshe Chekawa Yeshe Dorji to really articulate it through Atisha, and a few other teachers along the way. So the second stage, so then what? How do we work our way towards breathing in universal suffering and sending out just the power of this loving, spacious heart? And the way that I've practiced this is to then apply the teaching, the sending and receiving, to someone that I know who is struggling. Just keeping it simple. So if I have a family member that is really kind of struggling with a certain issue, I will begin by practicing mindfulness. I'll root myself in my body. I'll gain sort of a good mindfulness, a state of awareness, and I'll embody some equanimity and stability, and then open the heart and perhaps check in. What am I feeling? And bring love, bring compassion to that feeling, and then extend it out, widen the circle to this other person. And as I breathe in, I may be aware, oh, they're feeling depressed. So as I breathe in their depression. And as I breathe out, I send them love, spaciousness, the blessings of this clear, beautiful blue light of compassion. So that perhaps is manageable. Now, here's the thing that can happen in there. That their grief, let's say it's grief, may trigger our grief. Right? Do you think that's possible? That, oh, this person that I love is feeling this feeling, and yet I too have this feeling, and now I'm starting to feel bad, and I can't get to this heart of spacious compassion, this ideal, yeah? And so that's why we then back up the practice a bit and come back to our own feelings. This practice, in my experience, needs to be agile. It needs to be able to move wherever the need is in that moment, so that if I'm getting overwhelmed with the sadness of my family member, I can recognize, okay, this is common to both of us here. And in order to be of benefit, I'll come back and I will breathe in my own grief and extend love to my grief, others to feel this, and then maybe I will go back to this person. So what we're doing is taking it skillfully, step by step. And then maybe it becomes about a group of people. Maybe it becomes about a population that has historically been oppressed, or maybe the environment. I just read something about horses in Uruguay that are raised, and 80% of these horses are sent to slaughter. It is horrifying. And so maybe it is something that, I feel really strong about, whatever it might be, or people in war zones, that kind of thing. And maybe that population, I will first check in and see, how am I responding to this population? Maybe there is helplessness. I'll work with helplessness and I'll breathe it in. I'll actually make room for it. That's what I'm doing. When I inhale my own helplessness, I'm basically opening myself to what's there and then exchanging it with this compassionate, boundless heart. And then maybe then I could then go to whomever I'm practicing with or for, or the population or the environment, and then take in the suffering there, exchange it with compassion. But I work up to that. Now, I still haven't gotten to universal suffering. Why? Because I'm training myself to get there, enough to where that second half of Tonglen, the radiating love through myself and to others, really is strong enough. And then this third stage being practicing with all beings, all living beings, all sentient beings, which in my experience can be inaccessible unless I train first to get there and strengthen the capacity. As a boundless quality, which compassion is seen to be, we have these 4 boundless abodes in Buddhism. We have loving kindness, which is laying kind of the foundation for compassion, the wish for happiness for ourselves and for all beings. Compassion itself, empathetic joy, and then equanimity. And yet, the boundlessness of compassion can feel so abstract, just by going right into it. Which is why we need to begin with grounding ourselves within the personal, within the body, so that we can connect heart to heart around not just the suffering, but the potential, the fundamental goodness. So we don't just see the suffering in the other person or in the population or in all beings, but we're also acknowledging within that suffering that there too is capacity for love, that the person I'm practicing for is a loving being, that they too have at their core fundamental basic goodness and Buddha nature, if you will. This is how I was practicing as a chaplain full time for 5 years. It wasn't just walking into the room of a patient and just quote unquote seeing the illness, but it was seeing past it. The illness doesn't identify this person. Their suffering doesn't identify them fully. Yes, we pay attention in a caring, wholeheartedly engaged to the suffering, but we also are seeing beyond it. This was sort of my whole premise in the work, and that helped me stay resilient around doing end-of-life care and loss and things. That there was potential, there was possibility here too. And if I can be part of catalyzing the spark for that possibility, so be it. If I cannot, I have to be okay with that too. I'm almost through here. One of the things that is often the case is that for many people, actually practicing compassion for oneself first is actually harder than practicing compassion for someone else. I don't know if any of you have had this experience, but I hear this a lot. And so it may be that we begin practicing first bringing compassion or metta or loving kindness or maitri to our beautiful 4-legged furry friend, which Jim has right there in his arms there. Maybe that helps to open this flowering of the heart so that compassion is possible, and then we bring it to ourselves. It may also be that we practice a benefactor meditation first, bringing to mind the benefactors, the people who have taught us love, who have shown us how to be loving and compassionate beings, and practicing gratitude for that love, and then knowing this is part of me now and radiating that out. So there are ways that we can work with this resistance of self-compassion that is so ubiquitous. So ultimately, this notion of bodhicitta, the mind of awakening, is really about not abandoning suffering, but becoming free in the midst of it. This is what I learned really well with my separation, my divorce, and with the grief that I will always be grateful for teaching me this lesson. When my father died in 2017, I had an opportunity to practice that again. And it was much easier. It was much easier in some ways. It was something that I knew, the terrain, I knew it well. And so it really is something that creates resilience for us, I think. It doesn't mean that we don't have pain up the road, but we then have capacity, curiosity, and caring to bring to that pain. We, in essence, change our relationship entirely with the suffering. The last thing I'll say here is something that Leslie, my teacher, used to talk about from the standpoint of motivation. Why would I want to practice experiencing my own suffering? Why would I want to go through this process? What is it that keeps me, in Shantideva's words, from being a Buddha? And that is what Leslie used to tell us, that as long as we are pain-driven, whether we realize it or not, it's going to be very hard to progress on this path, whatever this path looks like for you. And so part of the work is transitioning from being pain-driven in our intentions, motivations, to being love-driven. And here, love-driven meaning big love. Yeah? And knowing the difference and cultivating that so that freedom from the pain doesn't mean having to get rid of it. But we are bringing a more spacious, a wholeness into it. We're becoming more whole. We're becoming more fully human. And that which speaks to our potential as humans. So we can continue to love. We can continue to grow. Now, that doesn't mean that this is, I got it now. Now I'm going to do it. This took me a while to put into practice. And there was some intensity there. But man, the fruits are so worth it. And I think this is partly what Shantideva is trying to get us to see. He knows when you read this text, the Bodhisattva Way of Life, you really have a sense that this man himself struggled with things and that he had a lot of love for people. The way he writes this with so much intensity and so much fire and passion. So